Well, hello and welcome to the Zone. I'm your host, Big Wave Dave.
Dave's not here!
So we are in the middle of our three-part series on refuting evolution. Today, we're going to take a closer look at natural selection and adaptation. But first, let's have a review. During our last session, we discovered that the word evolution has a lot of different meanings.
No, it doesn't. There's only two. The colloquial usage refers to any change over time, but unless otherwise specified, when scientists speak of evolution, they're referring to the one and only theory of biodiversity, summarily defined as descent with inherent genetic modification. Paraphrased for clarity, it is the process of varying allele frequencies among reproductive populations, leading to usually subtle changes in the morphological or physiological composition of descendant subsets. A single individual bearing novel characteristics is not evolution yet, not until that trait is inherited by its descendants and then spread through the wider group via population mechanics. Then it becomes the sort of change over time that we regard as within the theory of evolution. Successive generations can expand biodiversity when continuing variation between genetically isolated groups eventually lead to one or more descendant branches increasingly distinct from their ancestors or cousins. So whether we're talking about adaptation or the emergence of new breeds through artificial selection or new species or higher taxa via natural selection or genetic drift, whenever one population becomes two or more morphologically and genetically distinct ones, even by selectively breeding a new line of dogs or deriving new cultivars in agriculture, all of that is evolution.
Let's take a closer look. So the first one is adaptation. Now this is the ability for living creatures to adapt to the surroundings, to changes in the environment. Next would be genetic variation. Now, this is recombinations of existing genetic information. Well, what does that mean? Well, to make it simple, when two dogs have a puppy, the puppy will have genetic information from both of the parents.
Big Wave Dave Bisbee pretends to be teaching science, but he's deliberately not teaching science. Rather, he is undermining science by censoring and misrepresenting it. He doesn't want students to know what I showed him last time, that there are two processes responsible for genetic variation, recombination and mutation. According to geneticists, the textbook explanation is that mutation is the ultimate source of genetic change. But Bisbee doesn't want kids to know that because it would undermine his belief in a magical creator. So he will not admit that fact even when presented with proof. That is how dishonest creationism is. Instead, he only tells kids about recombination, a half-truth, which is another form of lying, as if Bisbee knows more than all the expert specialists in their own field.
Then there's natural selection. Now, natural selection is a process. It is the elimination of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate.
That's another lie by omission, again in the form of a half-truth. While natural selection can eliminate some organisms, it doesn't necessarily have to. Better performing or hardier lineages can emerge from less capable populations without those other populations having to go extinct.
Now, what's important to remember is that these three are scientific fact. They're observable science. We can see them happening and we can do experiments to confirm them.
Including the fact that mutation is the main source of genetic variation and that natural selection is not necessarily an elimination of unselected forms.
Very unlike this one, Darwinian evolution. Now, Darwinian evolution is a belief system. It is the belief that all creatures evolved from non-living chemicals over billions of years.
This is a different sort of lie, not merely a half-truth, but a complete misrepresentation, a bald-faced, factually false and misleading misstatement made with deliberate intent to deceive. Each sentence has at least one lie. 1. Darwinian evolution is not unlike the other examples. It, too, is a matter of observable, confirmable fact. 2. No scientific theory, nor any other aspect of science, qualifies as a belief system. Belief systems are faith-based rather than evidence-based. They have required beliefs and prohibited beliefs, while science is based on free thought. It's a matter of inquiry instead of belief, investigation instead of assumption, and scientific methodology works exactly opposite of faith. The third lie is that Darwinian evolution is the belief that all creatures evolve from non-living chemicals. That's an entirely different field of study, traditionally called abiogenesis and now referred to merely as origin of life studies. Evolution is a theory of biodiversity via descent with inherent modification, usually genetic modification. That means that there have to be ancestors to descend from and to be modified from. 4. Evolution doesn't always require billions of years. That depends on how much of it you're looking at one time. Plenty of evolution, even macroevolution, is observable in real time. Most Christians believe that God created life, but that everything has evolved since then. And even young Earth creationists accept that evolution happens, and they even insist that macroevolution happened impossibly fast, though they don't know what they're talking about, and they don't even know what any of these words mean. And finally, there are different forms of evolution, and Darwinian evolution either means a theory distinct from Lamarckian theory, or Darwinian evolution is limited only to the mechanisms Darwin himself proposed, natural and sexual selection, which, both of which creationists now accept. So Bisbee lied about that too. There is no academic source that would give the definitions Bisbee uses, and he knows that. Instead, every source contradicts him, and he knows that too. I've already corrected him on every one of these points, and I notified his company about that directly, though of course they ignored correction because they don't care what the truth is. They want to make believe, and make your kids believe, something else instead. In this video, Bisbee just repeats every mistake I already corrected in my rebuttal, even though he knows how and why all of that is wrong, because creationists don't correct errors, they just repeat them. So rather than have me repeat everything I already said in that previous episode, I'm going to call in a friend, evolutionary biologist Jackson Wheat, and hear how he explains all these things.
Hello everyone. Thank you to Aaron for having me on. Let's listen to Big Wave Dave attempt to refute evolution. None of the three so-called definitions Dave gave were actually definitions of evolution. Adaptation isn't a definition of evolution, but a result of natural selection. Genetic variation is a part of the process of evolution, and natural selection is a mechanism of evolution. Lastly, Darwinian evolution is a type of evolution, but it isn't the only one. There are non-Darwinian mechanisms of evolution too, like genetic drift and gene flow. Broadly, the definition of biological evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over generations, and this definition was developed by population geneticists like Ronald Fisher, J.B.S. Haldane, and Sewell Wright back in the 1930s. Darwinian evolution, which was the original version of evolution that Darwin developed in the 1850s, isn't defined as time plus chance equals life, but that beneficial variations are chosen through natural and sexual selection, gradually leading to speciation over the course of generations. Dave is apparently confusing the modern theory of evolution with Darwinian evolution as well as abiogenesis. All these terms have different meanings to biologists, but Dave doesn't really seem to care. Most creationists don't, because they don't know there are differences at all.
Now, what's interesting is there was an evolutionist named Sir Fred Hoyle, and he was a mathematician as well. And one day he sat down and said, I wonder what the odds of evolution producing goo to zoo to me and you. What are the odds of that happening? Well, they're the same odds as rolling a 6 on a dice 5 million times in a row. It's the same odds of a tornado ripping through a junkyard and creating an airplane. Sound impossible? It is.
So, there's a lot wrong here. First, Fred Hoyle rejected a lot of evolution, so I'm very hesitant to call him an evolutionist. He even thought Archaeopteryx was a hoax, which would be quite an impressive hoax considering we have 13 specimens of it. Second, the implicit assumption in this dice-rolling argument is that we know every single step of evolutionary history, from the origin of life to modern humans. I'd love to see a citation for that argument. Third, the tornado in a junkyard analogy had nothing to do with evolution. It concerned the supposed odds of abiogenesis occurring on Earth. Weirdly, Hoyle thought abiogenesis happened all the time, but in space. He and his student, Chandra Wickramasinghe, argued that viruses and bacteria continually fall to Earth from space. You may even be familiar with the article that came out in 2018 where a few scientists argued that octopus had genes from space. That was Wickramasinghe and his hyperpanspermia proponents.
So Darwinian evolution is actually a belief system that is not founded on good science. You get it? Cool.
There are pervasive misconceptions in creationist circles as to what observable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable mean. They don't mean the actual historic events in question have to be observable, testable, and so on, but that the evidence for them is. Is there observable evidence for a meteorite wiping out the dinosaurs? Yes. Can we test hypotheses about the extinction of the dinosaurs? Yes. Can we repeatedly come to the same conclusions about the evidence? Yes. Are our hypotheses about the extinction of the dinosaurs falsifiable? Yes. We don't need a time machine to figure out what killed the dinosaurs, nor do forensic experts need time machines to directly witness a crime. There can be a variety of circumstantial evidence that very strongly indicates who the perpetrator is, hence why many cases rest on DNA evidence.
All right, so let's talk about today's topic. How do creatures adapt? Well, the creatures use a system or a process called continuous environmental tracking. And to give you an idea of how that works, let's start by talking about cars. So a few years ago, Google invented a car that is capable of driving itself. Well, how can it do that? Well, it uses continual environmental tracking. So the first thing they did is they equipped this car with all kinds of sensors. It knows how fast it's going, the objects that are around it, what the weather conditions are. And just to give you an idea of how this all works, let's look at a common scenario. Let's say that the Google car is driving along, and it detects the car in front of it. And it sends that information to the computer and says, wait a minute, time out. I am too close to that car. Now, because of the programming that the engineers put into the car, it says, okay, I'm too close. I know what to do. And the car automatically applies the brakes. This slows down the car and makes it maintain a safe distance. The car will keep doing this. It'll keep detecting all the conditions around it and make the changes necessary to arrive safely at its destination. Guess what? Animals do the same thing.
I have never heard this term continuous environmental tracking before. I've read at least a couple hundred technical papers on evolution, dozens of books on evolution, and seen a variety of documentaries and videos about evolution, and I have never seen anyone reference continuous environmental tracking. Of course, there's a reason for that. It's not a term used in biology, like polystrate fossil, megasequence, genetic entropy, or complex specified information. Since Dave explains this term with reference to cars, it's possible engineers invented the term first, but creationists are applying it in a completely different context. As Dave explained, it basically just means responding to environmental stimuli. Wonder why he didn't just go with a term everyone already recognizes.
Let's look at a few examples. You remember this guy? The Arctic fox? He actually detects the changes in the weather and the conditions around him. And what he will do is in the wintertime, he will turn his coat white, and in the summertime, it'll be brown. Now this helps him hunt and stay safe from predators. If you see the pattern there, it's continuous environmental tracking. He's detecting, he's processing, he's responding, and then the process repeats. Have you ever heard of a blind cavefish? Now these are fish that don't have any eyes. So scientists have made some really cool discoveries. What they found out is that the eggs, when they're in the water, they actually detect the conditions of the water around them. In this case, conductivity. And based upon that, if it's low conductivity, they will inhibit or produce less of certain type of proteins, which results in no eyes. Now, what's really interesting is if you take those same eggs and you put them in different conditions, those fish will be born with eyes. There it is again, detecting, processing, responding, and repeating.
The Arctic fox is merely displaying seasonal hormonal changes, but Dave's attempted explanation of the blind cave tetra Astyanax mexicanus experiment is wholly inadequate. As shown on the slide, Dave is referencing the 2013 paper Cryptic Variation in Morphological Evolution, HSP 90, as a capacitor for loss of eyes in cavefish. Dave says that simply by raising the cave tetra eggs in different conditions, the fish can be born with or without eyes. That is, humorously but unsurprisingly, directly contradicted by the paper. It says, quote, "However, raising Astyanax embryos in the presence or absence of light had no effect on eye size," close quote. The point of the experiment was to detect the amount of standing eye size variation in the surface-dwelling Astyanax populations, testing a hypothesis originally put forth by Conrad Waddington in the 1940s. First, the researchers knocked out a protein called heat stress protein 90, which is HSP90, in the surface-dwelling Astyanax, and this generated a wide amount of eye size variation. Then, the researchers wondered what sort of environmental trigger could also cause such variation, hitting upon lowered conductivity as one example. Under low conductivity, which the cave dwellers experience but the surface dwellers don't, eye size variation also increases. In effect, Dave was completely wrong about the point of the experiment and its results.
This has got to be my favorite, the Crucian Carp. So, northern pike, this big fish here, they love to eat these guys. Now, what's interesting is as that carp passes through the northern pike's digestive system and goes into the water, the other carp detect this. And within 24 hours, they begin to change into this. That makes them harder to eat by the pike. Now, this is incredible because these are adult fish, not eggs. So Mr. Pike here, he's going to either have to do one of two things. He's going to have to eat the carp when they're younger, or he's going to have to find another source of food. Detect, process, respond, repeat.
What is the relevance of this argument? Here is Bisbee's logic, if I may call it that. If he sees something, anything in nature, he doesn't understand any of it, so he always thinks it's magic. He doesn't call it magic, he calls it a miracle. But the two words have essentially the same definition. Either way, it's not an explanation. He doesn't even know what evolution is, and he doesn't understand how science works either, so the best he can do is convey confusion. But evolutionary theory has explained this, where creationism hasn't and can't explain anything. Allow me to illustrate. Evolution is a theory of biodiversity. There is no universally consistent taxonomic classification for fish. That's just a colloquial term for a certain set of character traits that we see in some chordates. Cladistic taxonomy is monophyletic, meaning that the parent category includes all of its evident descendants, not just some of them, so that rather than classify something as a fish, we call it a chordate instead. Now, most people think of fish as vertebrates, but there are a couple of exceptions, both extant and extinct, of things that we would commonly call fish, but that don't have vertebrae. Remember that in evolution, being a theory of biodiversity, means that one original group diversifies into many, according to a branching tree pattern. And within vertebrate fish, there are some with lobe fins and some with only ray fins. The ray-finned group produced carp, and a dozen or so other families that all further subdivided into several more subfamilies, further diversified into hundreds of collective genera and thousands of individual species, including Carassius, also known as the Crucian Carp. Now, every one of these species is a modified version of whatever its ancestors were, and every group of these has developed their own unique distinction, traits by which they can be identified. Now, a supernatural creator could just conjure whatever he wants out of nothing, in which case there should be myriad unique forms that wouldn't show any indication of common ancestry whatsoever. As you can see in every myth or movie, that is the common condition for created creatures. But we've never seen that in real life. Everything is evidently related to everything else through a taxonomic hierarchy. Then, as these groups diversify, they happen across many different adaptations after living tens of millions of years under certain environmental conditions, with random mutations occasionally being selected for some specific benefit. Such that some fish have honed special skills or adapted advantageous shapes in their fins or their eyes, and every lineage has its own different thing. This one being that the body will change shape due to chemical cues, whether it's the presence of predators or the type of foraging that they're able to do where they are. It's all chemistry. Nothing ever happens by magic. I mean, miracles. So this is the sort of thing we should expect to see. Unique modifications in particular species, always within an evident taxonomic lineage. This is consistent with and explained by the evolutionary model, and is neither consistent with nor in any way supportive of creationism.
Last example. You ever hear of deer mice? So these are mice that live all over the country. And scientists have discovered that the mice that live in the prairies have shorter tails than the ones that live in the woods. You see, the ones in the woods could use those tails to balance on branches and that sort of things, right? What's interesting is if you take mice from the prairie and you put them in the forest, and you take mice from the forest and you put them in the prairie, in the next generation, the tails will adjust again. Detect, process, respond, repeat. That is continuous environmental tracking, and it's how animals adapt.
The Crucian Carp example is neat, but with regard to the deer mice, Dave's explanation of the scientific paper he's citing is totally wrong. He's citing the 2016 paper, The Ultimate and Proximate Mechanisms Driving the Evolution of Long Tails in Forest Deer Mice. The paper seeks to understand the genetic loci involved in the long tails of forest deer mice because, as Dave points out, having a longer tail is useful for a forest habitat. Now, the researchers didn't release the forest mice into the prairie and vice versa. They crossed forest mice with prairie mice to understand what the genetic basis for the tail length variations was. Further, the picture that Dave shows that compares east to west forest mice is a demonstration that east and west forest mice independently lengthen their tails, and both types of forest mice have tails that are longer than prairie mice. This work had absolutely nothing to do with swapping environments. So all four examples are adaptations that arose at some points in the past, but Dave provides no explanation for how they arose in his model. Were those adaptations simply bestowed on the originally created ancestors, or did they evolve afterwards? Dave never says.
But he did say that if forest mice were dropped in the prairie and vice versa, then their tails would change in the very next generation. No, it seems that Bisbee believes in Lamarckian evolution, which does not work the way Darwinian evolution demonstrably does.
But there's something really important to remember. Animals, creatures, do not change from one kind to another. You will never see a fish become a bat or a bird or a dog.
Well, at least we agree on that.
Because there's no such thing as a kind. A bat, a bird, and a dog are all the same kind in that they're all amniotes. They're all tetrapods, too. They're all vertebrates as well, and even chordates. Cladistically, they're all fish. Creationists will not provide a consistent definition of kinds because they know that there isn't one, not one that doesn't also contradict what they want to believe.
Speaking of kinds, the Bible says that God made all the creatures according to their kind. What does that mean?
That's a good question, one that creationists will not answer. The idea is that a kind is whatever original animals that God supposedly created unrelated to anything else. The Bible gives only one working definition of a kind, being whether two animals could interbreed and bring forth after their kind. That's the same definition as the biological species concept for sexually reproductive animals. And these ideas were fine for ancient people of the Levant who only knew of a few animals in their immediate proximity, but when they started learning about world geography and the myriad other species around the globe, they soon realized that their idea of Noah's Ark wasn't big enough to hold them all. Especially not after they learned about paleontology too, which shows 100 times more variety in the fossil record. Of course, it was also about that same time that they learned about evolution and taxonomy, both of which they used to patch the new hole in the Noah's Ark fable. So they evoked a form of super-accelerated macroevolution at hyperspeed to go from a few hundred original species on the Ark to the million or so modern species almost immediately. They couldn't just ignore the paleofauna either, because the Bible said that God would personally send every animal that had the breath of life to be saved. So the young Earth extremists had to put dinosaurs and all other fossil orders onto that Ark, even though they also called for for more than 90% of that biomass to go extinct immediately as soon as they got off the boat again. Carolus Linnaeus noticed when he tried to classify all life forms that they do not fit into the concept of created kinds as he expected they should. Instead, they're nested in a taxonomic hierarchy which only evolution could explain. Religious fundamentalists ignored that when they realized that they couldn't use the working definition equivalent to species. They had to move it up the Linnaean ranks to some arbitrarily determined higher position that could be variable as need be to move the goalpost whenever necessary. Again, the Bible's conflicting definitions of kind work against them, because while the Bible talks about different kinds of cattle and beasts and birds, only two kinds are ever identified, and the Bible contradicts itself with each one. Twice, the Bible specifies that birds are a kind unto themselves, which should imply that God created one pair of birds, out of which all other species evolved, including the extinct ones. But the Bible also says that there are all kinds of birds, and that Noah had to take 7 pairs of every kind of bird, not just 2. So birds don't represent one kind, but several kinds, meaning that God magically conjured all of these unknown number of birds that all look like they're related, and they're all birds. So why aren't they all collectively the bird kind? And if birds are their own kind and dinosaurs are the beast kind, then how does that apply to Paravians, who are clearly both at once? 1 Corinthians says that there's one kind of flesh for humans, another for animals, another for birds, and another for fish. Except that birds are animals, and so are fish, and so are people. And we have exactly the same flesh as the other mammals. Even Ecclesiastes says that mankind is part of the beast kind, and that the only reason we don't admit that is because of our vanity. So the Bible couldn't say what a kind is, not because God didn't know, because he didn't write it. People wrote the Bible, and they didn't know what they were talking about.
Well, this is the system that biologists use to classify all the different life forms. If you haven't seen this yet, you will when you get into high school. So kinds fits in right about at the family level.
No, it doesn't, because while 2 species in the same genus may be able to produce infertile hybrids, and thus already cannot bring forth after their kind, 2 species from different genera, even in the same family, usually can't produce anything at all.
And just to help explain it, it's actually quite simple. We have lots of different chickens, but only one chicken kind. We have lots of different species of dinosaurs, but only about 60 to 80 kinds. In this case, these are the Ceratopsia, and you'll probably recognize a few: the Triceratops, the Styracosaurus, the Centrosaurs. All those belong to the Ceratopsia kind. And finally, we have lots and lots of different dogs, but only one dog kind.
Ironically, Dave says the kind isn't the species, but that it's the taxonomic family. However, he gives 2 examples that are species, and none of his examples are the family level. The chicken is Gallus gallus, a single species, though some authorities have lowered it even further to a subspecies. Ceratopsia is an order of dinosaurs, and dogs are Canis domesticus, another species or perhaps subspecies. There's no consistency to his kind designation whatsoever. Of course, there never is with creationists, because they are trying to reify an arbitrary taxonomic construct. Taxonomic families can contain anywhere from 1 to tens of thousands of species, and systematists recognize that. Taxonomic ranks are, as Aaron likes to say, merely signposts for navigating clades. They don't inherently mean anything other than that the organisms contained within them are more closely related to each other than to another taxonomic group.
So what we see in nature is this. Animals stay within their kind. There's the cat kind, the dog kind, the bear kind, all kinds of kinds.
Here, his dog kind seems to include all of Canidae, but that's not what he indicated merely moments ago. In fairness, he may not actually know that there are more species of canids than just dogs. Oh well.
Big Wave Dave Bisbee also doesn't understand that each of these so-called kinds shares a genetic phylogeny, confirmation that they are related, and they all have transitional species linking them, some of which still exist today. And how can you say that bears and dogs are different kinds when there are bear dogs and dog bears in the fossil record, proving that they're all the same thing?
We've covered a lot of material so far. Let's talk about natural selection. Woolly mammoths once roamed the earth, and they were amazing creatures. They're kind of like elephants, only much bigger and stronger, and of course, all that fur. Well, during the Ice Age, there were millions of these creatures. But then, towards the end of the Ice Age, most of them were wiped out by gigantic dust storms.
I have no idea where he came up with the notion that mammoths were collectively wiped out by massive dust storms. He doesn't cite anything, and I've never even heard other creationists make this argument. The only response I can offer is, citation please?
Now, I would imagine, based upon some of the fossil finds, that some of them tried to go to a different location. So let's say that they were to go down south to get away from the ice and to get away from the dust storms. The problem with this is that these areas would be way too hot for these creatures. So they would have to do one of three things. They could leave, try to go someplace cooler. They could quickly adapt, maybe shed their hair, or they're going to perish. In the case of the woolly mammoths, they perished. They are now extinct. But you know what? Their cousins, the elephants, just love that kind of weather.
So did Columbian mammoths and the extinct elephant Paleoloxodon, both of which are tropical, and neither of which Bisbee knew about. Nor does he know about any of the many other extinct proboscideans, mastodons, and so on, the earliest and simplest of which being very similar to the earliest Sirenians, which evolved at about the same time and evidently from a common source.
Now, if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend this book. You can get it from Answers in Genesis. It is fantastic.
No, it's fantastic only in that it is a fantasy. You're not going to learn much biology by reading such fiction, especially not from an organization whose mission is to manipulate the masses through deliberate deception. Instead, check out my video on the phylogeny challenge, which proves that there is no such thing as a kind, because creationists cannot show us 2 or 3 of them and explain how to tell them apart or explain what they are. Because every taxonomic family is part of an ancestral superfamily and suborder and so on, inextricable from everything else.
See, natural selection is the elimination of creatures that are unable to adapt or relocate.
You're always wrong.
Now, sometimes some evolutionists give natural selection almost magic powers. Check out this quote. This gentleman believes that bats evolved from small four-legged mammals, probably something like a shrew. Natural selection just retooled things, gave them wings and different shapes and bones and nervous system and all kinds of things. Now, even he, at the very end of his statement, says that, it seems pretty impossible. However, since we have bats, it must have happened.
So Dave is straight up misrepresenting what Jerry Coyne is saying. Coyne is saying that it may at first glance seem impossible for winged mammals to evolve, but they did, and there's quite a bit of data on the evolution of bats. Tony Reed and I tackled it in my video, Bat Evolution.
Time out. Shrews and bats are really different creatures. If we're going to go from a shrew to a bat, we need all kinds of new information to be able to create these features.
No, as Coyne pointed out, you are modifying existing features. You're not making a whole bunch of new ones. Most of the genes possessed by shrews are also possessed by bats. Studying the genomes of bats shows that they repurposed existing genes and structures.
When you hear something like that, here's some questions to ask. First of all, since these creatures are so different and bats are so incredibly complicated, where did nature get the information needed to create these new features? And by the way, how would a creature that is half bat and half shrew survive? I mean, think about it. He's got these floppy wings that don't really do anything, so that's going to make him not be able to run. And of course, the wings aren't done yet, so he can't fly. It sure seems to me that natural selection would eliminate a creature like that.
Is Dave not aware that sugar gliders, flying squirrels, and colugos exist? Does he think gliding animals can't exist?
Also, you ever hear of echolocation? Bats have this amazing sonar system that enables them to locate insects. It is incredibly complicated. How did that come about, just out of nowhere?
Bat echolocation is based on the same features and genes that exist in other mammals. Laryngeal echolocation is done with the larynx, which we have, and tongue-clicking echolocation is done with Drumroll, the tongue, which we have. The genes involved have changed somewhat, having developed certain mutations in the ancestors of bats, but again, most bat genes are present in other mammals. Bat echolocation certainly didn't develop out of nowhere.
And finally, why are there no pre-bats in the fossil record?
Well, there are bats in the fossil record with characteristics distinguishing them from modern bats. For instance, the Eocene bat, Onychonicterus, has more wing claws than modern bats, wasn't capable of echolocation, and was a less capable flyer than modern bats. I think that qualifies it as a pre-bat. And that's about it. Big Wave Dave should really stop teaching biology because he doesn't seem to understand it at all. Thank you again for having me, Aaron.
Thank you, Jackson. Appreciate you.
And finally, please remember, the point of all these lessons is not to win arguments. It's to be able to reach people for Jesus Christ.
You know, listening to these creationist arguments that are always so bad and so wrong and so ignorant of everything, it makes you think that this guy is either stupid or dishonest. It's at least one or the other. But you don't have to decide which it is, because creationist apologists are usually both.